Expanding on the ideas of the Four Noble Truths, I want to take a moment to reflect more deeply on what these teachings have meant in my own life and how I've come to understand them over time. When I first encountered the idea that life is suffering, it struck me as harsh, almost fatalistic. I remember feeling an instinctive resistance to the thought that suffering is such a central part of life. It felt like admitting defeat, as if to say that no matter what I do, things will always be just a bit disappointing. But the more I sat with this teaching, and the more I experienced life itself, the more it began to make sense, not as a declaration of doom, but as a wise observation of how things really are. The Buddha's first noble truth, when fully understood, isn't telling us that life is meant to be a never-ending parade of misery. Instead, it's an honest look at the fact that no matter how hard we try, life is rarely, if ever, perfect. There's always something that feels just a little bit off. It's like a persistent itch or a subtle discomfort that we can't quite shake. You know those moments when everything should be going well, work is steady, your relationships are stable, you have your health, but still, something feels incomplete. That's what the Buddha was pointing to when he talked about dukkha. The word dukkha is so often translated as suffering, but that single word doesn't capture its full meaning. Dukkha is more like a general sense of dissatisfaction, a constant background hum of "this isn't quite enough." It's the feeling we get when things don't go our way, but also the feeling we get when they do. And somehow it still doesn't satisfy us the way we thought it would. It's like the wheel of life is just slightly out of alignment, never turning quite as smoothly as we wish it would. There are, as the Buddha explained, 3 levels or types of dukkha. The first is the most obvious: physical and emotional pain. This is the kind of suffering we can all relate to, because it's the kind that comes from the unavoidable realities of life. We all get old, we all get sick, and eventually, we all die. There's no escaping these facts, and they bring a kind of suffering that is simply part of the human experience. But even more subtle than that is the second kind of dukkha, which comes from impermanence and change. This is the suffering we experience when we can't hold on to what we want, when things shift or slip away from us, despite our best efforts to cling to them. I think we've all experienced this second kind of suffering, whether we realize it or not. It's that feeling of losing something or someone we love, or even the subtle frustration when life doesn't go exactly the way we planned. We might not always recognize it as suffering, but when we zoom out, it's clear that this constant change is a source of discomfort. The irony is, we live in a world where change is the only constant, and yet we spend so much of our time trying to resist it, trying to keep things exactly as they are. We want to hold on to our youth, our relationships, our successes, but life, by its very nature, doesn't allow for that. Then there's the third kind of dukkha, which is a bit harder to pin down. This is the existential kind of suffering, the kind that comes from just being human and living in a world where things are conditioned. This form of dukkha is more like a deep, underlying sense of unease or restlessness. It's not about any one specific event or circumstance, but more about the human condition itself. We wake up each day and go about our lives, but there's always that little voice in the back of our minds that wonders, is this all there is? It's the gnawing feeling that something's missing, even when everything on the surface seems fine. What's interesting is that all these forms of dukkha share a common root: attachment. The second noble truth tells us that it's our craving, our clinging, that causes dukkha. We want things to be a certain way, and when they're not, we suffer. We grasp at things we think will make us happy, whether it's possessions, relationships, or achievements, only to find that they never quite deliver the lasting satisfaction we're hoping for. And so we're like drowning people reaching for anything that floats by, only to discover that what we've latched onto is fleeting, temporary. It provides a momentary sense of relief, but soon enough, we're back in the same cycle of craving and disappointment. I've noticed this pattern in my own life, especially when I reflect on the things I've pursued in the hope that they would bring lasting happiness. For a long time, I thought if I could just achieve certain goals, or acquire certain things, that sense of dissatisfaction would finally go away. But the truth is, even when I've reached those milestones, the feeling of what next has never been far behind. It's a bit like chasing a mirage. No matter how close you think you are, it always remains just out of reach. The good news, though, is that the Buddha didn't leave us hanging with just the recognition of dukkha. The third noble truth offers a way out, a way to end this cycle of suffering. The Buddha taught that it's possible to find an end to dukkha, not by changing the external world, but by changing our relationship to it. This is where the fourth noble truth comes in, the noble Eightfold path. It's not a quick fix or an easy solution, but it offers a practical way to move beyond suffering, step by step. The Eightfold path is often broken down into three main categories: wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Through wisdom, we learn to see things as they really are, without the distortions of our cravings and aversions. Through ethical conduct, we cultivate a way of living that aligns with our deeper values, creating harmony both within ourselves and with others. And through mental discipline, particularly mindfulness and meditation, we develop the ability to observe our thoughts and emotions without being carried away by them. It's this combination of insight, morality, and mental training that leads us out of the cycle of dukkha and into a more liberated way of being. One of the most profound aspects of this path, for me, has been the realization that true happiness isn't something that depends on external circumstances. I used to think that if I could just arrange my life in a certain way, everything would fall into place, and I'd finally feel content. But the more I've practiced mindfulness, and the more I've reflected on the teachings of the Buddha, the more I've come to understand that real peace comes from within. It's about cultivating a mind that is stable and equanimous, regardless of what's happening around us. This doesn't mean we become indifferent to life or stop caring about what happens to us and those we love. Far from it. It's about learning to engage with life fully, while also recognizing that clinging to any particular outcome is where the suffering arises. Even physical pain, which we usually think of as an inevitable source of suffering, can be experienced differently when we approach it with a cultivated mind. Instead of resisting or fighting against it, we can observe it with curiosity and acceptance, and in doing so, it loses some of its sting. What's most hopeful about all of this is that the path to freedom from suffering is always available to us. It's not reserved for a select few or for those who live in monasteries. It's a path that anyone can walk, regardless of their circumstances. And while it may take time and effort, the rewards are well worth it. Life will still have its ups and downs, but with a mind that's trained and attuned to the reality of impermanence, we can navigate it with much more grace and ease. In the end, the teaching of the Four Noble Truths isn't about resigning ourselves to a life of suffering. It's about waking up to the way things really are, and then using that understanding to free ourselves from the unnecessary suffering we create through our attachments and aversions. It's an incredibly optimistic teaching because it shows us that, while life may be imperfect, we have the tools to find peace and happiness within ourselves. And that, to me, is a message of hope and empowerment that resonates deeply.